It began with a photograph, a small dust-covered print found inside a weathered leather case in the attic of an English farmhouse in 1921. The edges were frayed, the paper yellowed, but the image itself remained disturbingly clear. It showed a funeral procession outside St. Mary's Church, a modest stone chapel standing alone on a windswept hill in Lincolnshire. Mourners dressed in black lined the cobblestone path. A wooden casket rested upon a carriage flanked by lilies. The church bell tower cast a long shadow over the crowd, frozen in perfect composition. At first glance it was unremarkable, one of countless Victorian funeral photographs meant to preserve dignity in death. But on the back, written in fading ink, was a date, March 14, 1885. The problem? Parish records confirmed that the funeral depicted in the image took place 3 days later, on March 17th. Even more chilling, the man whose name appeared on the burial certificate, Arthur Hemsley, was still alive when the photograph was supposedly taken. When the discovery surfaced, it spread quietly among collectors, then exploded into fascination among historians, photographers and paranormal investigators. How could a funeral be documented before it occurred? Experts examined the photograph. No sign of tampering, no double exposure, no reprinting. The negative preserved alongside it confirmed its authenticity. Some claimed it was a hoax crafted by a grieving family. Others believed it to be a time slip, a phenomenon where moments from the future imprint upon the present. But as the evidence deepened, the mystery only grew darker. Today, the Hemsley funeral photograph remains archived under lock and key, catalogued and studied by researchers who cannot explain its existence. And so the question endures, haunting those who've seen it. How could a photograph capture a funeral that hadn't happened yet? And a man who was still alive when the shutter clicked. England, late 19th century. A nation balanced uneasily between progress and superstition. The cities pulsed with the heat of the Industrial Revolution, iron rails cutting through green hills, coal smoke clouding once blue skies. But in the countryside, in villages untouched by modernity, old fears still ruled quietly. People spoke of omens, of photographs stealing souls, of mirrors that should be covered when death entered a home. In the Yorkshire village of Lavenby, life moved to the rhythm of the mines. A settlement of fewer than 200 families, its air was thick with soot and rumour. The miners worked long days beneath the earth, and their wives whispered of ghosts that lingered near the shafts. Illness was a constant, and funerals were frequent enough that mourning became a form of community ritual, black dresses and lace veils hanging like a second skin upon the village. Among them was Henry Talbot, a 42-year-old undertaker, whose name had become quietly respected if not feared. He buried the dead, but he also photographed them, a practice that blurred the line between duty and obsession. With a heavy brass camera and glass plates coated in chemicals that smelled of vinegar and dust, Talbot documented the village's moments of loss. The images were solemn, composed, respectful, meant to grant permanence to the impermanent. In the spring of 1891, he accepted what seemed like an ordinary commission, a family portrait outside St. Mary's Church, just beyond the mining fields. The weather was fair, and the villagers stood neatly posed beneath the spire. Talbot developed the plate that evening by lamplight, expecting a typical family image. But what emerged was impossible. The photograph revealed a funeral scene. Pallbearers, a coffin, veiled mourners, arranged exactly as though death had already visited. Yet no one in Lavenby had died that week. The same faces captured in mourning were still alive and working the next morning. Days later, tragedy struck. A mine collapse claimed several of the very people seen grieving in Talbot's photograph, their positions and expressions matching the image with chilling precision. The photograph would pass from hand to hand, studied, doubted, feared. But the question it posed has never faded. Was this a coincidence, a flaw in early photography? Or did Henry Talbot's lens capture something that defied the natural order of time? 3 decades after the strange spring of 1891, the village of Lavenby had changed little. The mines still groaned beneath the fields, though fewer men worked them now. Time had softened the memory of Henry Talbot, the quiet undertaker who once walked the cobbled lanes with his camera box and tripod, until his name became nothing more than a faint whisper in local gossip. It was 1921 when the past was disturbed again. During renovations of St. Mary's Church, workers found a small iron-bound trunk buried beneath a loose floorboard in the vestry. Inside were papers browned with age, glass photographic plates wrapped in linen, and a single envelope marked in careful handwriting, Talbot Collection, Lavenby, 1891. The trunk was passed to Arthur Wainwright, a retired schoolteacher turned local historian, who had been volunteering to catalogue the church's forgotten artifacts. Wainwright spent nights in the rectory attic, surrounded by dust and the sweet faint scent of old varnish. Most of the plates showed predictable scenes, portraits of families, stoic miners, baptisms and weddings. But one negative stopped him cold. It was labelled simply, "Before the Bells." When developed, the image revealed a funeral. The composition was almost cinematic. Mourners gathered around a coffin outside St. Mary's, the church tower looming behind them like a silent witness. Women's veils fluttered in the faint wind, and the coffin's lid was adorned with white lilies tied in black ribbon. But what unnerved Wainwright most was the clarity, the faces, the folds of fabric, even the faint mist curling through the air. It looked as though the scene had been caught between worlds. Still, but alive curious, Wainwright cross-referenced parish burial logs, which the church had meticulously kept since 1802. The funeral matched exactly with the burial of Sarah Whitcomb, a 26-year-old miner's wife who died on April 9, 1891, 3 days after Talbot had dated the photograph. Her coffin's carvings, her dress, even the floral arrangement were identical to what appeared in the picture. At first, Wainwright suspected human error. Perhaps the photo was mislabeled or misfiled. But when photographic experts in Leeds examined the materials, they confirmed the glass plate and chemical composition were consistent with spring 1891, not later reproductions. Even the ink used to label Before the Bells tested genuine. Then came a stranger discovery. Among the papers was Henry Talbot's own journal, its pages filled with neat handwriting that grew increasingly erratic toward the end. One entry dated April 6, 1891, the same day the photograph was taken, described an unusual atmosphere that morning. The air was thick, as if the light itself were reluctant to settle. A dark fog rolled through the churchyard, though no smoke rose from the mines. The Whitcomb woman stood oddly still, her eyes unfocused. When I developed the plate, she appeared pale, as if fading before me. The journal ended abruptly, a blot of ink trailing off mid-sentence. Wainwright, unnerved, presented his findings to the Yorkshire Historical Society. What began as a harmless cataloguing project now resembled a temporal anomaly, a photograph that captured an event days before it occurred. Witnessed by both camera and man, the evidence was undeniable. The date, the scene, and Talbot's eerie account aligned with impossible precision, and with that, a quiet church in rural Yorkshire became the epicenter of one of the strangest photographic mysteries in British history. They called him a man of science, a meticulous technician, a perfectionist who believed that precision could hold back the chaos of the unknown. Henry Talbot was born in 1857 in the quiet countryside of Suffolk, a place of fog-drenched mornings and slow whispering winds. By the time he reached his 30s, photography was not merely an art to him. It was a philosophy. He once wrote that, "Light is a language, and the plate, its memory." Every exposure was a conversation with time itself. Talbot's surviving letters and fragments of his journals reveal a man both brilliant and haunted. He was known to work through the night, refusing food and sleep while developing plates under red lamplight. His assistant at the time, Thomas Berkeley, described him as restless, as though he feared that if he stopped working, something unseen might catch up to him. In 1889, Talbot began an experimental series he called The Boundaries of Light. He theorized that the camera, when exposed long enough, might capture the layers of reality that coexist in silence. He experimented with silver nitrate plates and glass negatives, setting up his cumbersome tripod in graveyards, at churchyards, and even in empty fields where, as he said, the air itself feels watched. His obsession deepened. His notes, written in neat cursive, begin to show small tremors of madness. One entry reads, "The longer the exposure, the more truth appears." Not all truth belongs to the living. By 1891, Talbot's work had taken him to the village of Lavenby, where a local family, the Whitcombs, had commissioned him to photograph a family portrait outside St. Agnes Church. It was meant to be simple: a mother, a father, and their daughter Sarah. The photograph that would later become known as the Whitcomb funeral was not intended to be a funeral image at all. From his journal, dated June 14, 1891, Talbot wrote, "The child Sarah seemed pale today. I adjusted for longer exposure, the sky dim though it was noon. The bell rang, but I saw no one at the ropes. The father looked to me and asked if I heard it too. I nodded, pretending calm. He described a dark fog that crept across the lens, though the air was clear to the eye. His camera, however, recorded something different: shadows where there were none, faint outlines forming before his subjects even moved. It was as if they stood in 2 times at once," he wrote. "One living, one already gone." When the session ended, Talbot appeared visibly shaken. He carried the plate back to his studio, but refused to develop it for several days. His apprentice remembered finding him sitting alone, staring at the camera as though afraid of it. Henry kept saying, the apprentice later recalled, "It saw too much." When he finally developed the photograph, the image was unlike anything he had captured before. The Whitcombs stood together, but Sarah, the daughter, appeared slightly transparent. Around her feet were scattered lilies, though none had been present during the session. Most disturbingly, the reflection in the church window behind them revealed a small coffin, one that had not yet existed. 3 days later, Sarah Whitcomb died from a sudden fever. The coffin in her funeral matched the reflection in the photo precisely. The same flowers, the same bowed heads. Even the positioning of the mourners experts decades later would claim the photograph was an accident, perhaps a double exposure or a chemical reaction in the emulsion. But when the plate was examined in 1921, no evidence of mechanical fault was found. The chemicals and paper were genuine to their time. The impossible, it seemed, was authentic. As for Talbot, his writings after the Whitcomb photograph grew darker, almost feverish. He spoke often of echoes trapped in the glass and the camera's hunger for what is yet to come. He refused further portrait work and instead began taking photographs of empty rooms, deserted streets and graveyards at twilight. His assistants left, frightened by his silence and strange rituals. He was seen speaking to his developing trays as if negotiating with something unseen within them. In one of his final letters, sent to a colleague in Cambridge, Talbot wrote, "I no longer believe photography captures the past. It steals from the future. Light remembers before we do." Then in the winter of 1893, Henry Talbot was found dead in his studio. The door had been locked from the inside. Around him lay dozens of undeveloped plates, all sealed carefully in black paper. When the authorities examined them, not a single one contained a human figure. Only the faint impressions of fog, empty chairs, and light itself, bending, reaching, as if trying to form faces that were never quite there. Some claimed he took his own life. Others whispered that the camera finally turned its gaze back on him. The truth remains uncertain, but in his last diary entry, written 3 days before his death, he left one chilling line: "I saw them morning before the loss had come. The lens sees what man cannot." And with that, Henry Talbot vanished into the shadows of his own creation, a man consumed by the very light he sought to understand. For nearly 80 years after Henry Talbot's death, the photograph remained sealed away in a wooden box marked Talbot Collection, Lavenby, 1891. It gathered dust in the church cellar until 1972, when renovations once again unearthed the forgotten archive. Among yellowed ledgers and mold-stained hymn books, archivists found the glass plate negative, still wrapped in its black paper, labeled simply, "Before the Bells." The image quickly drew attention. A local newspaper printed a short piece about Yorkshire's haunted photograph, and within weeks, the Royal Photographic Society dispatched a small team to authenticate it. Their task was to confirm whether it was an elaborate Victorian hoax or something else entirely. The examination took place at the Society's London laboratory, under the direction of Dr. Raymond Pritchard, a respected photographic historian, using microscopy, ultraviolet analysis, and emulsion testing. His team began their meticulous investigation. Their findings were published in a brief but startling report: no evidence of manipulation. The emulsion layers showed no scratching, retouching, or composite blending. No signs of double exposure. Light density across the plate was consistent, indicating a single moment of capture. Exposure, time aligned with daylight outdoor conditions, typical of an overcast English afternoon. Chemical, composition of the silver nitrate solution, matched formulas used between 1888 and 1893. Aging, patterns of the glass and paper label confirmed authenticity to the 1890s. Short, the photograph was genuine, yet one detail refused to align with natural law. When the analysts measured the direction of shadows, they discovered something impossible. In the image, the shadow of the coffin stretched toward the east, though St. Agnes Church faces eastward. If the photo had been taken in daylight, as records suggested, the shadow should have fallen west. It was as though the light had reversed itself, illuminating the scene from an impossible angle. At first, the anomaly was dismissed as a printing defect. But even under spectral analysis, the distortion remained consistent with true shadow behavior, implying that in that frozen moment, the laws of time and sunlight themselves had shifted. The discovery reignited public fascination with Talbot's work. Over the following decades, the photograph appeared in journals and documentaries exploring paranormal evidence. Physicists, psychologists, and historians each attempted to explain how a single 19th century plate could defy both chronology and physics. The theories. The time slip hypothesis. Dr. Alan Havers, a theoretical physicist at Cambridge, proposed that Talbot had unknowingly photographed a localized temporal distortion. In this model, time is not linear but elastic, capable of folding upon itself. He argued that Talbot's long exposure technique might have intersected two overlapping moments, allowing the camera to register an event not yet occurred. The camera, Havers wrote, did not look backward or forward, but simply sideways into another layer of time. Skeptics mocked the idea as pseudoscience, yet Havers' equations describing temporal elasticity would later inspire legitimate quantum time perception studies in the early 2000s. The psychic imprint. Theory psychologists from the Society for Psychical Research revived an older, spiritual concept known as residual energy. The theory suggested that emotionally charged events, especially those involving death, could imprint onto environments. Talbot's camera, sensitive to light and vibration, might have captured that psychic residue before the actual tragedy unfolded. Dr. Eleanor Marks described it as a photograph not of what was, but of what was about to be, the future echoing backward through collective grief. She pointed to Sarah Whitcomb's illness, her parents' worry, and the entire village's shared anxiety in the days before her death. Perhaps, Marx theorized, those emotions projected unconsciously, forming a visual premonition on the plate. The mass hallucination hypothesis, others, like sociologist Peter Lamb, took a different stance. He argued that the supernatural interpretation came later, after Sarah's death. According to this theory, the villagers' memories realigned with the imagery once they learned of the photograph's eerie resemblance to her funeral. The mind, Lamb wrote, is a more effective darkroom than any photographic studio. It develops what it wishes to see. While plausible, this explanation could not account for the shadow anomaly, nor the confirmed chemical age of the photograph. No collective memory, however vivid, could alter emulsion decay or light direction. Parallels and precedents, the case did not stand alone. Victorian archives from the Society for Psychical Research document numerous incidents of premonitory visions, dreams, sketches, even daguerreotypes that appeared to predict death or disaster. In 1875, a Liverpool photographer captured a family portrait later found to include the faint outline of a deceased child who died days afterward. In 1886, a railway worker's wife reportedly drew the scene of her husband's fatal accident 2 days before it occurred, an image eerily identical to the official report sketch. These stories, dismissed as superstition, now re-entered discussion. Was Talbot's photograph another entry in a long lineage of time disturbances, a mechanical prophecy rendered in silver and glass? The blurred line between science and faith by the late 20th century Debates around the Lavenby photograph no longer centered on fraud or authenticity. Both had been settled. The question had evolved: what does the photograph mean? Could a camera, a tool of reason and precision, act as a bridge between consciousness and the unseen? Could light in its infinite reach glimpse moments yet to come? Dr. Pritchard himself, once a skeptic, grew increasingly philosophical. In a 1983 interview, he reflected, "The photograph cannot be faked." But perhaps we misunderstand what a photograph is. It is not proof of the past, merely proof that light once touched something real. And who are we to say whether that moment belonged to yesterday or tomorrow? Today, the Lavenby funeral plate remains preserved at the National Archives of Photography in London. Still cold, still luminous, still unsolved. Visitors describe the faint impression of motion within the glass, as though the mourners shift ever so slightly when one looks away. Whether artifact or omen, it continues to whisper the same impossible question Henry Talbot asked more than a century ago: can light remember what has not yet happened? By the early 21st century, the photograph had become a footnote in niche journals and paranormal compilations, a curiosity from the age of gaslight and superstition. Yet in 2010, technology offered new eyes to an old enigma. The British Digital History Initiative, tasked with preserving fragile Victorian archives, began scanning the Talbot collection using 8K high-resolution digitization. Each glass plate was cleaned, measured, and captured in microscopic detail, every grain of silver nitrate rendered visible for the first time. Among the collection, one image stood out: the Lavenby funeral photograph, still labeled "Before the Bells." Technicians noted the faint fog of age along its edges, the shallow fractures through its glass, the subtle iridescence of oxidized silver. Nothing unusual until the fourth scan. Under magnification, a reflection appeared. It was not visible to the naked eye, but within the digitized file. At the lower left of the frame, in the polished surface of the coffin lid, a human shape could be seen. At first, archivists assumed it was one of the mourners or a trick of light. But facial recognition analysis, cross-referenced against existing portraits, revealed a stunning truth. The reflected figure was Henry Talbot himself. His outline was unmistakable: the short-cropped beard, the high collar of his undertaker's coat, even the faint glint of his pocket watch chain. Yet something was wrong. His head was slightly bowed, his eyes blurred as if caught mid-blink, and his form seemed to stand at an impossible angle to the light source. The sunlight in the image fell from the west, yet Talbot's reflection was illuminated from the east, as though the light that touched him came from another moment entirely. When the discovery was announced, skeptics rushed to dismiss it as pareidolia, the human tendency to perceive faces in random patterns, but a forensic imaging team from the University of Exeter took interest. Using spectral layer analysis and shadow modeling, they confirmed that the reflected figure possessed depth, contrast, and anatomical consistency. In short, it wasn't a random distortion. Their official statement read, "No digital manipulation or visual tampering was detected. The reflection is intrinsic to the original emulsion layer, consistent with exposure contemporaneous to the primary image. In simpler words, it had been there all along." The revelation revived national fascination with the Lavenby mystery. News outlets labeled it the photograph that saw its own maker. Paranormal investigators claimed that Talbot had captured not only the funeral, but his own spectral imprint, foreshadowing his death 2 years later. However, the more unnerving question wasn't how his image appeared, but why he looked unaware. Photographic historians revisited Talbot's journals, noting one cryptic entry written days before the photograph was taken. The lens stares too long into darkness and finds what was never meant to be found. Was Talbot describing a technical difficulty or a premonition of his own? The more experts probed, the stranger the details became. The coffin's reflection upon deeper scan revealed no camera apparatus, even though Talbot used a bulky wooden model that should have been visible. It was as if the reflection had recorded only the man, and not the device through which he gazed. Meanwhile, an unexpected layer of the mystery surfaced from the archives of St. Mary's Parish Church. A fragile diary belonging to Margaret Whitcomb, Sarah's mother, contained a haunting entry dated March 7, 1891, 3 days before her daughter's death. I dreamt last night of her funeral. The churchyard was grey with fog. The bell tolled, though no one pulled it, and Henry stood by the coffin with his eyes shut as if in sorrow. It was so vivid I woke weeping. Certain it had already happened. The dream, nearly word for word, described the photograph scene, decades before anyone discovered it. Historians debated whether the dream had been written after the fact, but ink analysis confirmed the entry's authenticity. The coincidence, if one could call it that, bound together 3 witnesses across time: the mother who dreamed the funeral, the photographer who captured it, and the camera that preserved it before it occurred. As the investigation deepened, theologians, neuroscientists, and quantum theorists each offered their own frameworks. Some suggested retrocausality, the idea that future events could influence the present under rare quantum conditions. Others returned to psychic imprint theory, arguing that shared grief might ripple backward, recorded not by intention but by emotion itself. Dr. Louise Everett, a cultural psychologist who studied grief phenomena, offered perhaps the most human interpretation. When loss becomes unbearable, the mind will reach across time to make sense of it. Sometimes that reach leaves traces, in dreams, in memory, even in light. The line between explanation and meaning blurred. To the scientists, it was an anomaly of exposure. To the faithful, proof that the human soul could echo before departure. In 2011, the digital scan was displayed publicly for the first time at the National Museum of Photography in Bradford. Visitors who viewed it up close often reported a strange impression that the reflection of Talbot seemed clearer under dim light, as if acknowledging attention. Some claimed his gaze shifted slightly when they stepped closer, an optical illusion, perhaps, or the power of suggestion born from decades of myth. Regardless of belief, one fact remained immutable. The reflection existed, the timeline did not align, and no method, digital or analog, could replicate the effect using known physics. What began in 1891 as a simple village portrait had become a century-long meditation on time, death and perception. In the words of Dr. Everett, the Lavenby photograph is not about ghosts or prophecy. It's about the lengths to which we'll go to keep love alive, even if it means believing light itself can grieve. And perhaps that is what truly lingers within the image, not proof of the supernatural, but a silent testimony to human yearning, preserved in glass and shadow. For in the faint reflection of an undertaker who did not yet know his own end, we glimpse something achingly familiar, our refusal to accept that time, like death, cannot be reversed. Today, the photograph rests behind temperature-controlled glass at the National Archive of Anomalous Photography, catalogued under a quiet, almost reluctant label, provenance unresolved. The image, now more than a century old, remains pristine, its black and white tones as sharp as the day Henry Talbot fixed them in silver. Beneath it, a small plaque bears only 3 lines: Lavenby, 1891 photographer, Henry Talbot event, undetermined. Visitors pause before it longer than most. Some whisper prayers, others simply stare, unsure why a century-old funeral scene feels disturbingly familiar. The curators note that it is the only photograph in the archive whose authenticity has never been successfully disputed, nor conclusively explained. After Henry Talbot's mysterious death in 1893, his family retreated from public view. His widow, Agnes Talbot, was said to have destroyed most of his remaining glass negatives, hundreds of them, by fire. A neighbor later claimed she murmured, "He trapped things that should have been left to God." When questioned, Agnes said only that the plates captured time's shadow. None of her husband's personal effects survived the blaze. The Whitcomb family, too, faded quietly from the historical record. Sarah's mother, Margaret, died in 1898, leaving behind the dream diary that would one day tie her vision to the impossible photograph. With no surviving heirs, their lineage ended before the 20th century began. The cottage where they lived was eventually demolished, and the ground where the photograph was taken, a small patch beside St. Mary's Church, remains unmarked. Yet locals still speak of strange sensations there. Tourists who visit the site often describe an inexplicable déjà vu, a fleeting awareness of having stood there before. Some claim to hear faint echoes, the soft toll of a bell, the rustle of mourning cloth in the wind. Rational minds dismiss it as suggestion, the power of story-shaping perception, but for others the feeling lingers, a quiet recognition of something beyond time. Historians remain divided. To some, the Lavenby photograph represents nothing more than a technical flaw, perhaps a delayed exposure, a chemical distortion, or human error magnified by myth. To others, it stands as a chilling reminder that reality might not always move in a straight line. Professor Alan Ridgwell of the University of Durham phrased it best in his 2018 lecture. If the camera is a machine that captures the past, then what do we call it when it records the future? Error or evidence? The debate endures deep between science and faith, skepticism and wonder. The photograph, suspended in its glass frame, refuses to answer. In the end, perhaps its meaning lies not in what it proves, but in what it preserves, a moment that defies explanation, a reminder that even within the precision of technology, mystery endures. Some moments, it seems, occur twice, once in spirit, once in life, and somewhere between the two, frozen in light, lies the quiet funeral that waited for its own time to arrive. We take photographs because we are terrified of time, of watching the people and moments we love slip into the past. Each click of a shutter is a small rebellion against loss, a fragile attempt to hold still what was never meant to stop. Yet sometimes the image outlives its purpose. Sometimes it stares back. The photograph taken by Henry Talbot in 1874 is one such haunting rebellion, a frozen moment that somehow feels aware of what was to come. It reminds us that grief often travels faster than life itself. Maybe the funeral didn't follow the picture. Maybe it was already written within it, a silent prophecy hiding behind the glass. Our fascination with death is, perhaps not a desire to see the end, but to understand it, to make it less cruel by keeping its shadow in our hands. Still, in every preserved face, every motionless smile, there is a whisper. Time is never truly ours. In trying to capture the present, Henry Talbot might have photographed the future, a frame where time and sorrow met, long before the world was ready to see it.